Hey everybody, it's me, Jack, and I'm back with another Halloween-related movie review. Today I am reviewing the original Friday the 13th. Yeah, I know it's kinda late getting this review out, considering that last Friday was, Friday the 13th, but some things got in the way, so I ended up having to postpone this review. I hope you'll understand. Anyway, Friday the 13th was released in 1980, a year after Halloween came out. Halloween had sort of brought the slasher genre to life, and Friday the 13th continued it. And like Halloween, it wasn't very well received upon its initial release, but over the years has become a cult classic and spawned many sequels, becoming one of the biggest horror franchises of all time. Interestingly though, the original Friday the 13th is very different than the rest of the films in this series. In fact, if you watched it alone without knowing that it was called Friday the 13th, you wouldn't really think that it was a Friday the 13th movie. What do you think of when you think of Friday the 13th? You think Jason in his hockey mask killing people. But Jason isn't the main killer in this movie, only making a brief cameo at the end, and the hockey mask is nowhere to be found. The plot of this movie takes place at Camp Crystal Lake. A group of teenagers are opening the place up again, only to realize that the place has a death curse. Many people have been killed there before, and it looks like they're next, as a mysterious killer starts killing them off one by one. Friday the 13th is a very effective thriller. It makes good use of its camera work. The opening scene of the film shows the classic killer POV shot, as we see everything from the point of view of the killer. Some people have argued that this ends up making us root for the killer, but I don't really think so. It just helps make the killer come off as even more menacing. Throughout the film, they constantly keep tricking you into thinking that different people are the killer. The character of Mr. Christie drives the exact same type of car that we see the killer drive, so it makes us think that maybe he's the killer. We also have the character of Crazy Ralph, who is a really entertaining character, by the way. His character comes off as a possible suspect as well. Now, despite this, many people going in would assume that the killer would be Jason, because, it's Friday the 13th. But for those of us who do know the first Friday the 13th film well, know that Jason is not the killer, nor are any of the characters that you think might be the killer. The film definitely has some good scares as well, like the scene in which Jack, played by Kevin Bacon, is killed off is a really shocking and disturbing scene. We see the killer's hand come up from behind the bed, hold him down, and then we see an arrow pierce right through his throat, spurting blood everywhere. Or this scene, we have another good jump scare as a body comes crashing right through the window. The score of this movie is very good. The soundtrack sounds a lot like Psycho at times, and I'll talk a little bit more about the similarities between this film and Psycho later on. The characters of this film are not really much to talk about. They're very basic. They're just teenagers goofing around, and you're pretty much waiting for most of them to get killed off. What really makes this film, though, is the last third. If this film didn't have the ending that it did, then I honestly think that it would have just been forgotten as another slasher movie. But because it did have the ending that it did, it became a true genre classic. Alice, the only remaining survivor, comes across a seemingly harmless woman who identifies herself as Mrs. Voorhees. I actually missed that part when I first saw this movie, which was actually kind of a good thing, because if I had heard that last name, I would have been like, oh, this woman is related to Jason Voorhees, who again, I assumed was the real killer. But the fact that I missed that line made it even more surprising when it's later revealed that she is in fact his mother. At first she seems so kind and so caring. She seems like someone you could easily trust, which turns out to be a really bad thing, as she explains in a rather emotional moment at first how her son Jason drowned here many years ago. Despite that though, there's still a sense of darkness to the scene, as the music becomes even more suspenseful, and her character becomes even more creepy, until you eventually come to the realization that she is the real killer, and she goes from a kind old woman to a psychotic killer. Betsy Palmer, who plays her, really did a fantastic job. She conveyed that sense of kindness, but could also come off as incredibly threatening. You don't really see that many female serial killers. I've heard people say that they actually like Mrs. Voorhees better as a villain than Jason himself. And you know what? I actually do kind of agree. The thing is, Jason is very obviously the bad guy. The instant you look at him, you're just like, yep, That's the killer. Mrs. Voorhees, on the other hand, we see that many of the victims, before she kills them, completely trust her. Also, Jason is just so unstoppable. Mrs. Voorhees, on the other hand, is still a human being. This was the only film that she was in, because she gets killed off at the end. Which is honestly a shame, because again, I think she's a really good, really underrated villain. However, there's something else that my dad pointed out to me after I saw this film for the first time, and that is, this movie is basically a role reversal on Psycho. If you haven't seen Psycho, spoiler alert. In that film, we meet a man named Norman Bates, who throughout the whole film talks about his relationship with his mother. People are constantly killed off, and we assume that it must be his mother doing it, only to realize at the end that it is in fact him dressed up and pretending to be his mother, who died years ago. In this film, we have Mrs. Voorhees, a mother who is driven insane and kills people due to the death of her son years ago. Also, like Norman Bates, she does an impression of her son, which is really freaking scary. That's something that this film really doesn't get enough credit for. It's still just sort of seen as a fun slasher movie, but this is actually a really genius idea. And this whole last third is just so suspenseful, as Mrs. Voorhees constantly tries to kill Alice. It ends with a very gruesome decapitation of Mrs. Voorhees. The film could have just ended there and just been a standalone horror film, but oh no, they had to add in an ending that would set up sequels. However, this ending is definitely a good one. Just when you think everything is over, Jason, who we assumed was dead, rises up out of the water and pulls Alice under, only for Alice to wake up in a hospital. The police then tell her that they found no boy, suggesting that Jason is still there, keeping it open for many, many more sequels. Overall, Friday the 13th is a really enjoyable thriller, and again, that twist ending really does make the film stand out for me. I would definitely recommend Friday the 13th for anybody who's into horror films. I'm gonna give Friday the 13th 7 out of 10. So thanks for watching this review, and join me next time for my review of the original Saw. See ya then.